folks waiting here, and we've got a good quorum of guests, so I think we're going to kick it off. Just to do intros, I'm Jay Radosha. I work for Agrology. I kind of lead all of our sales and partnerships with Charlie over there. I come from the East Coast. I was a farmer first and then engineer second, and was lucky enough to join Agrology about a year and a half ago and work with some amazing growers in a lot of different crop types. Hand it over to you, Tony, to introduce yourself.
Yeah, Tony Chapman. I am the Senior Director of Wine Growing at the Donham Estate. Been here since 2019 and just appreciate Jay and Charlie and the rest of the Agrology team having me on today.
Charlie, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'll keep it quick. I'm Charlie Doobie, Head of Regenerative Partnerships here at Agrology. Background is in regenerative agriculture and veggies. And yeah, like Jay, I've been learning a lot from folks in wine and across a bunch of different crop types, and really excited for the conversation today with Tony.
Yeah, and today we're sort of here to talk about how regenerative management can create a better crop, a better product, and how Tony is really exploring that at Donham Estate. Just a few housekeeping items first. Everyone will be on mute today. If you have questions, please pop them into the chat. If you think it's a good question, keep popping it into the chat. We'll see it, we'll pick it out, we'll get to it. This meeting is being recorded, so if you have to jump early, you can always come back to it. We'll probably keep it rolling through the top of the hour if you want to hang with us, but again, it'll be recorded so you can come back to it if you have to jump. Just in terms of the flow today, Tony is going to sort of take the beginning here to walk us through his regenerative program at Donham, what they're doing, what they're seeing, what they're measuring, and the market opportunity that he sees there. Charlie and I are going to share some data that we've gathered inside of Tony's regenerative blocks. And sort of make some inferences about what's happening in the ecosystem and the soil. And then we're going to open up to Q&A for the second half. So please do keep those questions coming, and we'll get to them on the second half of the webinar. So with that, we're going to kick things off here and hand it over to Tony to talk about what he's working on at the Donham Estate.
Awesome. Appreciate it, Jay. Yeah. So like I mentioned, I've been at Donham since 2019, and coming in, Donham was farmed, I think, how a lot of vineyards are farmed in Sonoma and Napa. Herbicide under vine for weed management, systemic fungicides, broadcast pesticides, mainly for mealybugs here in Carneros. Pretty heavy tillage, kind of a thoughtless cover crop process, just very, very minimal diversity there, mainly just vetch and heavy legumes. And we've changed a lot over the course of being here. And we've seen a lot of incredible improvements in our soil health, in our vine health, in our fruit quality, and really an effect on the wine as well. Slide, Jay. So we have 5 estate vineyards. We have 2 in Carneros, our Donham vineyard, which is where our estate winery is based out of. We have TFV, which is only a mile and a half away, although very, very different soil, different microclimate as well. We have never gotten frost at TFV, knock on wood. Donham vineyard, we do have some frost pressure, so very different kind of management practices, even though they're very close together. Windside is our Russian River vineyard, 16 acres. We farm 20 acres on the true Sonoma coast at our Bodega vineyard, and we farm 43 acres up in the north end of Anderson Valley, Savoy vineyard. So we're farming just over 200 acres throughout Sonoma and Mendocino counties. Slide. So I think if you were to ask a dozen regenerative kind of farmers their definition of regenerative, they're going to have probably a dozen different answers. But one thing that they can all kind of agree on is kind of the main principles. And the main principles starting out is minimizing soil disturbance. Minimizing soil disturbance, we're going to reduce erosion. We're going to really create a nice habitat for our microbiome. in our soils, we're going to retain a lot more carbon. And this is something Charlie and I have talked about. I think minimizing soil disturbance in some ways has led to a lot of dogma around soil disturbance. And we could probably spend the whole hour talking about this, but really the philosophy we take here is minimizing soil disturbance and really paying attention to when we want to disturb the soil. A lot of our vineyards, some of our vineyards are farmed 100% no-till, like Savoy. Some of our vineyard blocks in Sonoma, we farm no-till. But we do manage some soil disturbance at the friable portion of the soil, really that top 4 inches of soil. And we do that mainly to prep a better seed bed to get our seeds in. And anybody that's interested in going down the rabbit hole on tillage and agriculture, I'd recommend you reading some of the works of Dr. Christine Jones. She's an incredible soil scientist based out of Australia. But really, if you disrupt that friable level of soil, you're breaking up a lot of the mycelium. If you seed right into that directly, especially if you spray a compost inoculant, a compost tea or a microbial inoculant over that, you're actually going to have a lot of regeneration of those microbes, restoring the populations of that beneficial fungi to where it was before this disturbance, in a lot of cases actually increasing it. Diverse cover cropping, very, very important pillar of regenerative agriculture. I think a lot of like organic vineyards, driving around the valley, I see these just really intensive legume heavy cover crops. And I think a lot of thought needs to go into cover crop, what you're planting. Seed is expensive. You know, you want a return on your investment. And looking at cover cropping from a soil microbial perspective, from a soil aggregation perspective, if you're just planting a lot of legumes, high density, it's the diet you're feeding the microbes are not much different than a conventional fertilizer. So with cover cropping, we're really looking at diverse cover crops, getting as many different plant family as possible, focusing on our objectives, whether that's going to be you know, that's going to change from site to site, block to block a lot of times, whether that's going to be trying to increase our soil structure and aggregation, or add certain minerals and nutrients back, or just increase porosity and water infiltration. Kind of transitioning into the next principle, livestock integration. I think in an organic system, you're really looking at cover cropping as really just putting nutrients back into the soil. But with regenerative perspective, you're looking at it in a much broader sense. And so if livestock integration is going to be a pillar, you really need to think about what you're planting for your animal and ruminant animal health as well. We have a few trials going on this year with fenugreek, which is a legume, and it has some great benefits to soil health, but it has a remarkable effect on ruminant animal health. It actually has been shown in some studies to lower methane emissions by up to 95%. I mean, pretty amazing. It really allows their digestive system to work really efficiently. Chicory is another one that comes to mind. It kind of works as a natural dewormer for sheep in particular. So there are a lot of considerations with cover cropping. Livestock, you know, we're reducing our tractor passes, especially in early spring where we have a lot of moisture and soils can be more prone to compaction. We're increasing our mineral cycling, adding natural fertilizer. The enzymes in the sheep's saliva are really stimulating the biology, and we see these massive flushes of growth after we graze. It's worked out really well this year to graze, pull them out of the vineyard, get some nice winter rainstorms, and that water just acts as a catalyst. And you see these large flushes of growth. Encourage biodiversity. This is, I just feel like, really low-hanging fruit. It's really easy to, you know, plant some insectaries, put in a little hedgerow, plant some native plants. But, you know, anytime we're investing in this kind of habitat, we're really kind of helping balance the ecosystem a bit. Year-round living roots, very important, kind of putting exudates into the soil continuously. I also like to have something in bloom, something flowering year-round. That can be a bit of a challenge, but I think having nectar and pollen and supporting our bird and beneficial insects populations is important. And then I threw in engager community, because I really think this is just such an important aspect of regenerative farming, especially in the wine industry. You know, going humbly over to your neighbors and, you know, this is what I'm working on. I've had some successes with this. I've had some challenges with this. I tried this. This didn't work. You know, what are you doing? What are you seeing? I think that's a big aspect to help propel regenerative viticulture in the wine industry. So what does this kind of boil down to? Well, for us at Donham, you know, our objectives, we're looking at it is we want to improve our soil health. We want to increase biodiversity, increase vine resilience, and really enhance the biotic terroir. I think we talk about terroir in a very abiotic perspective. We talk about growing degree days, average annual rainfall, fog intrusion, sun intensity, wind, soil composition, and these are all important factors. But what we're kind of missing from the conversation is the biotic elements of terroir and how this microbiome impacts those abiotic elements. You know, just a quick example, if you get 7 inches of rainfall and you're farming on East Paso, or if you're farming up on certain parts of the Sonoma coast and you get 70 inches of rainfall, if you're continuously spraying herbicide under vine, you have kind of like a dead, hard crust on top of the soil, really slow water infiltration, really bad porosity. You know, the impact of that is going to be a lot different. You're not going to really capture that kind of element of terroir. Yeah, so slide J. So soil health, what is it? I mean, we look at soil health as an emergent property of physical, chemical, biological interactions in the soil. And these interactions, you know, the idea is lead to resiliency from adversities that we face during the growing season, whether that's going to be extreme heat events, pest and disease pressure, frost in the spring, whatever that may be. Slide. So I think a lot of people here are probably familiar with a lot of these images and how important they are in farming systems. Just a few to touch on, you know, aggregate stability. You know, we talk a lot about aggregate stability, how important these microbes are for aggregate stability, you know, especially at depth. I think we talk a lot about a soil structure in like the top 10 inches of soil, but anybody that's farmed grapevines knows, you know, what we are really looking for is aggregate stability at depth. We want these grape roots to go very, very deep. Having a healthy microbiome is going to lead to better aggregation, better soil aggregation, more aeration, better root penetration, better water infiltration. Also, I have to touch on microbial biomass and the diversity there. 50 to 80% of soil organic matter is dead microbial bodies. 50 to 80%. So if you are trying to increase your soil organic matter, trying to increase your water holding capacity, retain more moisture, it's imperative. We have to increase your microbial biomass in your vineyards. Slide.
Yeah, Christine Jones talks about that, right? It's pathway. That's,
yeah.
You want to build soil carbon. Putting carbon on it isn't really going to do as much as just stimulating biology, right?
And on the aggregate thing, just one thing that I remember I heard, Jay and I heard this from the Understanding Ag guys, the average length of life of a single aggregate is only like 21 to 27 days. So you have to continuously be building it, right? And so without biology, there's no way you can do that. It's not like you just like create good aggregate once and it's done. They're constantly forming and then deforming and being decomposed, which I thought was amazing.
Absolutely, yeah. So really focusing on driving that, you know, down deeper into the soil as well. You know, most carbon in the soil is found 30 centimeters and below. So yeah, so, you know, why does soil health matter? Well, you know, these microbes are helping the vines with nutrient uptake. They're taking these minerals and nutrients, making it into plant available forms. They have that great symbiotic relationship. But they're doing a lot more as in terms of building soil structure. So mycorrhizal fungi, they are able to produce a glycoprotein called glomalin. and acts as kind of like a super glue for the soil, holds those soil particles together. Again, that's going to help with root penetration. It's going to help with aeration. That's going to decrease compaction. Just a lot of benefits there. And then when we look at these microbes, you know, it's an amazing how many interactions they have with the grapevine. I kind of think about them in kind of two camps, epiphytes and endophytes. Epiphytes being sometimes they're referred to as phyllosphere microbes, but they're going to be external on the vine. Endophytes are going to actually be, they're going to translocate the vine internally. And these a lot of times can act as biological control. So when you look at pathogens that we find in the vineyards, Eutypa being a common trunk disease, botrytis being a mold that can start in the canopy early season and work its way down into the clusters, but also powdery mildew, downy mildew, phomopsis, all these other pathogens. You know, these beneficials can outcompete and inhibit these from kind of taking a hold, which is really interesting. A lot of these microbes can produce antibiotics or antifungal compounds to kind of keep these in check. This also is going to affect the wines. When you think about balanced vine, you think about a vine that is allocating its resources, its energy, its carbohydrates really harmoniously between root, vegetation, reproduction. And when that happens, you have a lot of the vine's energy being put into those primary clusters instead of producing secondary and tertiary clusters. So greater complexity in the fruit. These microbes inevitably are going to end up in the fermenter. We're going to touch on that on the next slide, but it is going to have an impact on fermentation. And then if these microbes, if you have this healthy microbial activity going on, you're increasing your soil organic matter, you're going to retain more moisture. You know, hopefully that leads to less irrigation, smaller berries, more concentration of flavors. Slide. Okay, so healthy vineyards, they're going to make diverse yeast and bacteria populations. I don't think it's a coincidence. There's been so many studies from different institutions about the effects of native fermentations in the wines that show greater texture, deeper aromatic profiles, just more overall terroir-driven profiles. And really that is coming from the microbial life. You know, we know these microbes contribute to nutrient cycling in the vineyard, and they can help influence vine resilience to disease and pest. But they also are contributing to the wine's terroir. Endophytes, they actually can influence berry metabolism. They affect sugar accumulation, acidity, phenolic development. A lot of these microbes produce a lot of secondary metabolites that we can talk about, but these enhance the complexity of the wine and really are showcasing where they're coming from. When we talk about fermentation, you know, we know Saccharomyces is going to take over at around 5% ethanol. And once that happens, these other microbes, you know, their populations kind of shrink. But up until that 5%, it's a great window to build complexity in wine during that kind of lag phase of fermentation. These microbes, you know, can produce organic acids. Those are going to react with ethanol. They're going to form esters, a process called esterification. Some of these microbes produce thiols and terpenes. Other of these microbes produce high amount of glycerol, which is really going to affect the mouthfeel, the texture of a wine. Some of these microbes are known to produce antimicrobial compounds that are going to kind of keep spoilage microbes in check. So really going to add to the profile of the wines. Slide.
Yeah, it's so cool, Tony. And this is what got us really excited when we first talked to Tony, just this like depth of knowledge and this understanding of how microbial health of the soil can affect terroir and wine quality.
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, it's an exciting conversation to have. Looking at disease resistance, reduction in inputs, we've been able to reduce our inputs from farming this way. Another big tool that has really helped us is spore monitoring. We use Root Applied Sciences, who've been fantastic. I was just talking to Jay before we logged on. I'm really curious to overlay our data from our spore monitoring with some of the data that we're pulling from agrology. How does soil respiration, how does canopy temperature, where is that kind of affecting when we're seeing spikes in our powdery mildew spores, where we're seeing kind of low points. But yeah, definitely reduction in our inputs. And then secondary metabolites. So secondary metabolites, they're organic compounds. They're produced by plants, fungi, other microbes. They don't directly, they're not directly involved in the primary plant processes, such as growth, development, reproduction, but they serve really specialized functions in terms of communication, adaptation, and defense. So when we look at how important it is for these secondary metabolites to be produced for vine health, but when you look at these compounds, phenolics, terpenes, flavonoids, these are also compounds that we associate with quality wine as well. So it's kind of led me to the conclusion that if it's good for the vine, it's usually going to be good for the finished wine. Slide. So climate adaptation and carbon sequestration, I look at it as we're facing these adversities, every year with this climate chaos. I try to think of it as having like elasticity in our soils and in our vines. If we have these extreme heat events, I want to have a little bit more play in the soils and in the vines and in the fruit. If we keep our soils covered, we're going to have less radiation coming off the soils, and it's going to keep our fruit zone kind of cooler, our canopies cooler, and that's going to volatilize a lot less aromatic and flavor compounds out of the canopy. Obviously, we know the role of microbial decomposition and how that sequesters carbon. I know Charlie can talk a lot more eloquently about the liquid carbon pathway. Again, Glomalin comes back up, storing carbon long term. But improving soil carbon, you're enhancing the nutrient cycling, you're producing a lot of secondary metabolites, and this is all going to lead to deeper flavor development. Lastly, I think it's important, just more motivation to keep vines in the ground. It takes a long time for an adaptation to evolve. Once the vine has it, it's inheritable and it's going to get passed on indefinitely. So we're extra motivated to keep these vines healthy, keep them living, keep them adapting to the climate, keep them adapting to these adversities to better handle that stress. Slide. So we talked about kind of what we're doing in production, what we're doing on the winemaking side. How else does this affect us? It's been really great to see that a lot of our consumers are interested in what we're doing, increasing in our vineyard landing page on our website, having a lot of really good engagement on social media, hosting certain events. We're hosting another event next month called Sip and Sustain. It's going to be kind of a regenerative viticulture educational tasting masterclass. I'm going to be hosting that with Mark DeVere, who's a master of wine. But just to see the interest and the engagement is really, really interesting. And then also, I think this regenerative farming philosophy has really inspired a lot of our other departments, whether it's sales, hospitality, marketing. They're all looking for ways to help us achieve some of these sustainability goals and objectives. Slide. All right. Pass it over to Charlie for a bit.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about just sort of measurement. We've seen some questions in the chat about, well, how do you measure microbial activity? And that's sort of exactly what we do at Agrology. So our sort of measurement point, our key performance indicator on how healthy your soil is or how active the microbes are in your soil is how much CO2 is coming up out of the ground, right? All of these, or most of these, most of this biology is aerobic. So just like us, when they're active, they're breathing in oxygen, they're breathing out CO2. And that allows you to sort of understand how you're trending, how active the soil microbial community is. Dr. Rick Haney really pioneered a lot of this work. And the Haney test is something that's used to sort of provide, right, a baseline understanding of how much biology is there in my soil and how active it is. Where Agrology differs a little bit is that we're providing that readout in real time, and we're overlaying it with a lot of other data about the soil, like moisture and temperature. And also, we have a full weather station, and we have something in the canopy that actually sees how much CO2 the plant is exchanging with the atmosphere, whether it's a vine or a tree or even a cover crop. We can see how much photosynthesis is happening. And really what that allows you to do is get a full understanding of the small carbon cycle on the farm. And carbon is not, it's not like a bathtub full of marbles, right? It's not like you're just shoving carbon into the soil and it's staying there. It's energy, really. Carbon is energy in the soil. Your soil is the battery. Your plants are the charger, whether that's a vine or cover crop. And there's a lot of things you can do to modulate this cycle, like inputs, management practices, and so on. And really, that's the sort of key thesis of agrology is, we're measuring the small carbon cycle, and we're able to sort of tease out what impact the climate's having, like weather, temperature, moisture, and what impact is management having, right, by running these trials that are side by side. So, that's sort of how we deploy with all of our customers. And with Tony, we've been running a pretty interesting, we've deployed into a trial he's already been running to sort of gain this insight of how much climate elasticity has he built. Are we seeing that in the soils? Are we seeing that environmentally? And, how are we trending on soil health? Charlie, anything to add just on a general frame up there?
No, I mean, I just saw a quick question that about whether we measure N2O and whether we measure 12 months per year. And yes, we do measure nitrous oxide. We don't have the ability to measure methane yet, but we measure all 12 months per year. And that's really, I think, one of the cool things about agrology, right, is that you're getting a continuous view into the amount of microbial activity that's happening in your soils. And so for me, regenerative viticulture often has to do with finding those natural patterns in nature and like riding that wave, right? Or accentuating that. So, for example, if you're going to be adding, compost teas or microbial inoculants, you're not going to want to be doing that in a time when your microbes are dormant because you're essentially trying to feed something when there isn't that natural kind of vitality there. Um, but if you can see a continuous view into things, it can really be a helpful guidepost operationally. Obviously, you're going to want to take in, all the massive amount of data to make decisions on when to irrigate, when to fertigate, when to till, if you're going to till at all. But our system really allows growers like Tony to just have a much larger kind of data set, more eyes and ears into not only what's happening above the soil, but what's happening below the soil.
That's a good point, Charlie. And getting into some of the data here, I guess, Tony, it might be a little bit helpful for you to just sort of like frame up management practices in
Yeah, I
trial.
can talk about these two blocks where the sensors are, kind of give us a background. So we have two the agrology sensors. One of them is in a block 18.5. We farm this block 100% no till other than taking an implement across the soil before seeding. That again just disturbs that top portion of the friable soil about 4 inches deep, preps our seedbed for us. Other than that, there's no kind of deep tillage on this block whatsoever. Undervine as well, we manage that by weed whacking right now. Grazing helps a lot. And then 18.4, farm it regeneratively, but we do cultivate the soils. We use a spader for that. That block right now, historically, it's been every other row. This year, we're going to cut down on that a little bit. But they're the same exact rootstocks, 3309C, same exact clone, Calera clone, same training system, VSP. Yeah.
Awesome. So on this graph, we can see that, it's a little bit small, so maybe you can't see, but the red line is the regenerative no-till, so fully no-till. The blue line is with that minimal every other row tillage. We can call that minimal till. And in this graph, we're looking at the soil temperatures kind of going into winter and early spring. And this is something we've seen at a bunch of different vineyards when they're experimenting with regenerative practices. One of the great things about reducing your tillage is that it really buffers soil temperature. And that's also really important for the microbial communities. We see in our data that soil temperature and soil moisture are actually kind of two of the biggest driving factors for either increasing or decreasing microbial activity, microbial function. They're quite picky in terms of being in that Goldilocks range. And when we can keep our soils more buffered by keeping them covered, and keeping those temperatures more in that range, we're going to increase the likelihood of microbial proliferation, especially in these cooler months when, most of the microbial communities, they can go dormant when the temperature is too cold. Same thing when it's too hot. And then this also translates into canopy temperatures as well. So I'll let Jay kind of touch on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sort of sense, right? If you have a warmer soil, you're gonna have, that's gonna translate into the canopy as well. In addition to like reflection off of bare ground versus sort of absorption and the buffering that a established cover would provide. But in this case, both blocks actually had some surface soil disturbance, right? And they both had covers established. So in this sense, we're really just seeing that sort of transitional effect of the warmer soil equating to some, or I guess it's not even warmer, it's more extreme sort of soil swings, right? Up and down. That's what you see in this last slide, sort of translating into the canopy as well. And the two areas I like to think about this in terms of viticulture are early season and late season, right? So we've heard some growers talk about early season, maybe we can delay bud break a little bit, right? And sort of reduce frost risk by sort of buffering the temperature in the soils and in the canopies. Um, the other thing we've seen is, and we've observed this and measured it every harvest season when there's a regenerative trial, you're able to really modulate canopy temperatures and, reduce those extreme temperatures that are really damaging potentially to wine quality and grape quality, by a factor of real significance, especially in those hotter regions, right? We always refer back to our trial with Kane Thompson down in Paso, where he was able to, cut his number of days over 104 degrees by like 20 in a growing season. And, we observed this time and time again. In every sort of tillage trial, we see the soil temperature buffering, we see the canopy temperature buffering. And I think where that can really impact quality is, like I said, either early season trying to sort of push emergence a little bit out and reduce frost damage, or late season, protecting from those extreme temperatures, and that volatilization that you see
Yeah.
on that time.
I think one thing on that, Jay, is I think it's really important to kind of scream that one from the mountaintops. I think it's not a very well understood or appreciated benefit of regenerative viticulture is that you can really create like local cooling. You can allow your vines to do much better when there's these extreme heat waves, like in 2022, that just really decimated, a lot of Napa and a lot of Northern California wine production. It was really brutal. And we've seen, again, if you can reduce those days over 100 degrees or 105 degrees by 20, 30%, that can be really the difference between being able to continue to grow these high quality wines in these areas and not. And then what's really cool about this is literally local landscape level climate repair. That's how we actually fight climate change, is by first doing it on our vineyard and then doing it with all of our neighbors in our valley. And then from there, we just kind of can keep building out. So I think it's a really beautiful example of kind of climate action at a very local level, right? At your vineyard level climate is being changed and modulated by these practices. And it obviously has the operational benefits, but it also has that collective benefit of cooling the valley that you're in.
Yeah, and I think this is really interesting. I was chatting with Tony about this before the webinar. This is that right around bud break, right? Looking at the temperature difference in the canopies, in the tillage and the reduced tillage, or the reduced tillage and the no tillage blocks. And I asked Tony, did we see a shift in bud break? He said maybe a few days, pretty marginal. And we know these blocks are pretty protected, right, Tony? Like not a huge frost risk.
Yeah. And like, I mean, this will be really interesting to look at the data from, what we're getting this year and to track our bud break. We don't have any bud break in Pinot right now, in any of our vineyards. Although we're getting close, a little bit of bud break in Chardonnay and Carnero so far. Yeah, I mean, it'll be really interesting to see kind of the separation. Just historically, it's been a couple days between these two blocks. It'll be interesting to see what this year, 2025, brings.
Yeah, and I think in more extreme or less protected blocks, right, this could become more of a factor and you could see more of a separation.
Yeah.
So
I think the pattern, can you go back to that one really quick, Jay?
Mhm.
Just to be super explicit, the pattern that we're pointing out here that we're our hypothesis is that this can really benefit reducing our frost risk is kind of like a false spring, right? So in the tillage block, we have these really high, much higher temperatures. The blue line you can see, March 3rd, February 27th, it's just getting higher. But then it's also getting cooler. So the March 8th, we left that little timestamp, and it shows that it actually got 31.8 degrees. So the fear is that by having warmer soil temperatures and warmer canopy temperatures, you're going to be kind of creating a false spring and pushing those vines to go through bud break earlier than they really should, and then you have a late frost event, and then we're in trouble.
And I'll just jump in here really fast, Charlie, and say like it might look like a very marginal difference down at the bottom as far as like the lower temperatures, but a marginal difference is all it takes to get frost damage. So even though the no-till is keeping the soils just slightly warmer, that really could be the difference between losing a lot of young shoots in the spring.
Thanks, Tony. Sort of transitioning to look at soil health from the lens of microbial activity, and this is really sort of our sweet spot with agrology. This is sort of a season long, or really from when we installed to till current view of respiration. So this is microbial respiration, how much CO2 is coming up out of the ground. We really only got in the fall, post-harvest into Tony's trial. So it'll be really interesting once we stretch this out over a full season. But one sort of trend that we've really that's been curious here is this sort of inversion between the two blocks. So again, you see that red is the no-till, that blue is the minimum till, but there's tillage there, there's disturbance. You can see that in the fall, there's significantly more respiration in that tillage block. And I think we went in right after you did all of your soil work, right?
Yes, it was October 9th. We went through till the 10th. We sprayed our compost tea, soil and canopy spray. And then I think it was the 14th or 16th where we seeded the cover crop.
Yeah. So, we got in there sort of right after that tillage and soil prep and soil work and seeding. And you can see that, as the soil was worked, that incorporates a lot more oxygen. It also breaks up a lot of, structure in the soil, and that creates sort of a feast for the microbes. And we see this after almost every tillage event. There's this big burst of activity that often stretches out, over the next few months. And that's pretty clearly on display here into December. But what's really interesting is now as we're coming out of the winter and the soils are starting to warm up, we actually see a reversal there, where that no-till block seems to be more active in the early spring, and seems to be pushing out a lot more CO2. So those soils are waking up and they're getting sort of a head start on that block that had some of that more intensive disturbance. Again, we're really not saying one way or the other. And I think this is where the conversation is going to get interesting in the second half of the webinar, tillage and how it can be used and how we shouldn't just think about it as black and white. But, this is a really interesting trend that we're seeing where these things clearly sort of invert over the winter. Just zooming in on that, right? So here's the fall. You can see that they sort of trend together, right? But that tillage block has consistently more activity. And then here we have the spring as the soils warm up. There's a few places where, the tillage block jumps above, but, if you look at the average, that no-till block seems to be sort of waking up and much more active from a microbial standpoint in the spring. And again, it's going to be really interesting to see how this stretches out over the course of the season, but interesting early results there. Keeping this moving so we can get to Q&A. Another thing we look at, right, and I said this earlier, was photosynthetic absorption of CO2. So this is sort of the other end of the small carbon cycle. How active is the photosynthesis in the vine and the covers? How much CO2 is being pulled down into the ground? How much energy is going back down into the ground? And it's really interesting looking at this because consistently, the tillage block has more CO2 in both the canopy and the ground level than the no-till block. So our inference here is that there's more active photosynthesis, or there's more efficient photosynthesis happening in that no-till block, right? And even though we see that inversion in the spring, you might expect, right, with more CO2 coming out of the ground in the no-till block in the spring, we might see that trend sort of flip on our sensors as well, where we're seeing more CO2 in the ambient canopy and the ground level. But that doesn't happen, right? Even though there's more CO2 coming out of the ground in February and March in that no-till block, it stays below that tillage block in terms of how much CO2 is in the ambient environment, which means, the photosynthesis is more productive and active in that no-till block. I flew through that, so just sort of to synthesize it again, we're measuring how much CO2 is in the air in each block. And across the fall and the spring and the winter, consistently in that tillage block, there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, which means there's less photosynthesis happening. So that's sort of an interesting trend when we see, that clear inversion here, and then that clear stability in the atmosphere, where, in that no tillage block, there seems to be more CO2 going into the ground and less CO2 in the air consistently throughout the season. We'll see if that sort of continues into the summer. So now just sort of our wrap-up slides. I think, Tony, we don't really have to hit on this. We kind of touched on it on that earlier slide, but, agrology is really sort of providing two data sets in this trial, both microbial activity and climate and microclimate. We're really excited to see that. I know there's a lot of other things you're measuring too, and we can get into that in the chat. But our overall goals is just to really go in depth with someone who's at a high level operating in regenerative viticulture, which is clearly what Tony is doing, and really tying that to both climate modulation, right, buffering, wine quality, and vineyard operations, right, driving costs down, driving better vine health, and ultimately seeing how that translates into the product of a higher quality wine.
Yeah, and I think to kind of wrap up, I think a lot more needs to be done on research to soil, vine, and wine connections, and there's some really interesting studies going on. Really interesting companies that are offering more data. Data we've received from agrology has been incredible. I know ETS just got a next generation sequencer. They're going to be able to test the entire microbiome coming in on grapes. So just a lot more, research needs to be done for us to make these connections. I think educating, having the conversation with wine industry professionals is imperative. I think wine is a great, it's a great medium to really get people excited about this regenerative farming in general, because it's so much more than just an alcoholic beverage, right? It's such a connection to this community underneath our feet. And then getting consumers excited about wine that's grown this way and made this way. I think that's huge. And I think there is a thirst for people to learn more about it and want to put their dollars behind wines that are produced in this manner. I also will say, with this type of farming, as Jay and Charlie can attest, there's not one size fits all. And it's why all our 5 estate vineyards are farmed differently. It's why all our 5 estate vineyards have different cover crop blends and different grazing plans. And so I think it's a lot of trial by error. I think one thing that's really helped us is doing a ton of trials, whether it's tillage trials, whether it's fungicide trials, cover crop trials, undervine management trials, trialing these things. And we take a lot of data in-house, but partnering with like a company like Agrology, it really helps us kind of get more empirical data that we can lay over the data that we're already collecting and help us make some better making decisions. So yeah.
Thanks, Tony. Well, it's yeah, such a pleasure working with you and your team. And yeah, we'll jump into some questions now. I think one that's definitely worth touching on, and we've chatted about this a lot, Tony, is the sort of dogma or like the black and white sort of approach to tillage. And especially in regenerative agriculture, there's a lot of proponents of regenerative agriculture that are pretty hardcore about it, where it's like, no, tillage is the devil and like we have to get it completely out. And I think that for me, it's really interesting to think about kind of almost like the philosophical roots of that statement and that kind of approach. And I think it really comes from almost like a philosophical view of humans as inherently always going to be destructive for the environment, right? That like in order to preserve an environment, the best thing we can do is just turn it into a national park and like get all the humans out. And I believe that humans can really be a keystone species of regeneration if we do it consciously and if we do it with a lot of basically really listening to the soil, listening to the ecosystem. And yeah, I know that you guys use tillage selectively, and I just, yeah, would love to kind of riff on this for a minute, thinking about how can tillage or any sort of, soil disturbance, how can that actually be used in a way where that's actually, it's actually creating more life in the soils and where it's actually being used in a way where it's an act of care, and it's an act of, yeah, creating more biodiversity, creating more life.
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard to break down where to even start from this. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the great things that regenerative has going for it is it seems like we've done a really good job of leaving like the dogma and any sort of religious aspects out of it. Tillage is the one kind of point I think where some of that kind of gets taken into this. And I've talked to some growers that, like you said, it's like they look at it as like the worst thing you can do to a vineyard. I've talked to some farmers that would rather use herbicide to terminate cover crops than to till. I don't share that philosophy and that belief, but I think it's a really, really interesting thing. I think thinking about and just being honest with, the benefits of tillage. There are some benefits of tillage, right? We're breaking up surface compaction. You are having these big flushes of carbon and release. And now the question becomes like long-term, what does that do for soil health? But I think, a lot of it goes back to cover cropping and your objectives. When a lot of your annuals and your cover crops, they're going to be producing a lot of root exudates through their whole vegetation cycle. And as soon as they turn reproductive, that's when they're going to start taking a lot of nutrients out of the soil. So how do you want to manage that? Maybe there's a block that's really high in nitrogen and you want to leave, oats growing year round to leach some of that nitrogen out and try to balance that. And talk about something that's really going to affect fermentation. If you have really, really, really high YANs, yeast available nitrogen in your fermentation, that's not going to be something that is necessarily a benefit to your fermentations. It can kind of ignite certain spoilage organisms in there. You could produce, really, really high temperature hot fermentations. Pinot Noir is already a hot fermenter, so you're just kind of exasperating that. When you have really high YANs in your ferments, it produces high levels of urea that can produce ethyl carbamate, which is a carcinogen. So, I mean, there's a lot of factors. There's a lot of things to think about. Certain plants in your cover crop might have a lot of benefits early on, but later on in its life cycle can act allopathically and do some damage to the grapevines. So there's a lot of considerations in that. And I think tillage fits into that as well. Yeah, I don't know if that, Charlie, if you want to jump in and maybe get it back.
No, that's great. That's great. You nailed it. Absolutely. I think, I mean, like, as you said, everyone who's really interested in this topic should go out and read everything that they can from Christine Jones. She is an amazing soil scientist. She retired, unfortunately, recently, but everything she's written is like gold. And she's the one who's termed this term liquid carbon pathway. And so just to kind of dial in on that really quickly, that is basically this concept that turns out to be very true, that if we get carbon into the soils through plants, liquid carbon, as opposed to putting physical carbon down like compost or manure, it's much more likely to turn into humus and that long-term storage, that recalcitrant carbon that we're going for. And she talks about how she would much rather have someone do some light tillage and then instantly replant cover crops, just like you're doing at Donham, versus herbicides. I think it's really important that we all are just super honest with ourselves and each other that herbicides are bad for all life. It's not just plants they're killing. It's really bad for the microbes, and we can show you many, many, many different versions of our data to show this, but herbicides are bad for soil life. They just are. So when we spray herbicides, although we think maybe it's better because we're just killing the plants on top, it actually gets down into the soil and really disrupts microbial communities, not just then, but kind of ongoing. Whereas if we go through with some tillage, and as long as the tillage is done at the right time with the right soil moisture, and then we get living roots right back in, yeah, we're breaking apart those aggregates, and yeah, we're definitely cutting up those mycelial networks. But if we're feeding them instantly and we have plant roots going down there and feeding those exudates to those microbial communities, then they'll repopulate. And sometimes they'll repopulate and even like spread in the vineyard or even spread deeper. And so there is this idea, and understanding ag, they've done a really good job championing this, although they are very much into reducing tillage. There's this idea that actually disturbance can be a thing that brings more life into our soils, that disturbance, whether it is bringing in sheep and doing, really intensive grazing event where we're bringing things way down, or whether it's really light tillage just on that top few inches, or even deeper tillage. If we're doing it in a way where we're listening to the soil and seeing the responses, then it can actually be something that's beneficial. And that's one of the places where we like to fit in as agrology, right? Is that we can be that listening device. We can be that way where growers can experiment and trial, do things. Because as you said, every regenerative program really does need to be bespoke and unique to that vineyard and that field. And so if you're doing all these trials and experimenting, the key is to follow that through by really listening and observing and then learning from what you see and hear.
Yeah, I mean, what you just touched on in terms of that process of planting cover crop and tilling, reseeding, it's such a fast way to build really good soil aggregation. And yeah, like you said, Christine Jones has incredible research on this. Also, I think like it depends what kind of implement you're using when tillage. A disc is going to affect soils much differently than a spade.
Yep.
So I mean, really, thinking about that, understanding what kind of soil texture that you have and what implement's going to be best on your soil, and then not over tilling, right? I mean, I think one of the things that a lot of farm labor contractors are guilty of is when they need more billable hours, run the disc through, right? Because they can charge for that, and there's not really any sort of objective to that, especially if the cover crop is terminated. And so I think, really, if you do have and work with FLCs, kind of really working with them and understanding, what they're doing and why they're doing it and when they're doing it. Like that's really, really imperative. And I've seen a lot of clay-based soils have a disc run through it, and then it creates so much soil smearing. And that's going to be due to the moisture content, but also just because of the implement itself, where you get a lot less smearing if you use a spade, potentially at that same time.
Yeah, absolutely. Implements matter, right? And that's another thing is like tillage is not tillage is not tillage. Every implement is different. Timing is key. Soil moisture, all these things are so key.
I see a question about mechanical weed control. So really early on in the season, we rely on the sheep to just eat kind of undervine growth down. During the season, we use a combination of a lot of different things. Again, it's going to depend really on a block-to-block basis, but on established vines, historically, we've been using the Clemens weed knife, which we like. We are kind of moving more and more towards undervine mowing, just to disturb less soil directly underneath the vine. We've done weed whacking in certain blocks that are just have really difficult aspects to run these implements on. With the young vines, it's very expensive, but with young vines, we'll typically go through with a spade and do a shovel pass, just to make sure that we're not nicking the young vines and the root stalks with the weed whackers, and that can cause a lot of issues for them early on with their development and establishment. But kind of a combination of those things. I think the undermined mowers have gotten better. A lot of them now come with a mower directly behind as well, so you can reduce your number of tractor passes. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks. We also have some questions just about your compost tea solutions. So there's a question of like how many gallons do you apply per acre? What's the source? What are the results of those applications? If you want to just talk about a little bit about your tea.
Yeah. Yeah, our compost tea program, we have 500-gallon brewers. We make it with vermicompost. We do add a few other little things in there in terms of catalyst. We add some of our, we make some 500 biodynamic prep and some biodynamic barrel compost. We throw that in there, and it's not biodynamic. That's not in like the teachings or anything like that, but I like doing it. I don't know, it makes me feel good. And then we put a lot of fish hydrolysate into it as well. We really focus on feeding the fungi in our compost teas. And one of the things we think a lot about in our soil is balancing that fungal to bacteria ratio. So we really want our compost teas to be fungal dominant. So we put a lot of fish hydrolysate in there to even more so than the catalyst, kind of feed them and keep them healthy. We brew for around 18 hours. And then we apply, and the application rate's different depending on how we're applying it. If we apply it as a foliar and compost and soil spray, we're usually doing around 30 gallons per acre on that. If we're applying it directly through the drip line as like a fertigation, the rate will vary, but I mean, I've done as high as 60 gallons per acre on young vine stuff on rootstock that we're just trying to get established, and we've seen some really big benefits with that. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Tony. We're coming up to the top of the hour, so if you're still here with us, had a few questions about the slides and recording. It'll all be sent out via an email to anyone who registered. And it will live on our website as well. So you can always come back to it. Can get to probably a few more questions, Tony, if you have some time. One thing I sort of wanted to loop back on with you, Tony, is you're obviously bullish on how all this soil health practice is going to affect wine quality. Have you seen any of that yet? Are you starting to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. That is a really great question. So one of the benefits, we haven't really even gotten into this. I don't know how much more time we'll have to get into this, but I try to carry these trials onto the winemaking side as well. So for instance, we have another tillage trial that is different from what we just went over on the slides, where it's no till, minimal till, and then more like conventional till. And it's a 3-acre block, so 1 acre a piece on those. They're all farmed regeneratively, but just with different tillage methods. And then we actually ferment those separately. So we harvest 1 ton each of them. We put them in tea bins. We ferment them separately. We treat them exactly the same way, but we're able to track their harvest chemistry, their finished wine chemistry, and then we're able to taste them and just see what we're experiencing when we're tasting these wines on the palate. That's something, Charlie, that we'll get to do next week, which I think will be really interesting because there's definitely a difference. But we do the same thing with, fungicide trials. We have certain blocks that we don't use any sort of traditional fungicides. We just use microbial inoculants, spray it on the canopy. Again, fungal spore monitoring has been, really crucial for us to kind of give us that confidence on that. But then fermenting those separately to see, are the fermentation kinetics differently, or is the finished wine different, the chemistry, everything like that. So I think that's been really interesting for us to follow. Like I said, with the ETS bringing on this new analysis to measure like the entire microbiome on grapes coming on, that's something that we're going to utilize this year and see, what that looks like. Yeah, I think that brought us right to 11.
Yeah,
I was trying to squeeze that all in there.
Yeah. So thank you for joining, Tony, and sharing all your wisdom. Probably have more opportunities to sort of share this knowledge as this trial progresses and as we gather more data. Tony and the Don team are always running events, so keep your eyes open to that. And if you have more questions, please do feel free to reach out. I'm just going to share my screen here. One last, our website is agrology.ag. Tony's info is up there. And you can find Charlie and myself just at J or Charlie at agrology.ag. So if you have questions that we didn't get to, you want to get a hold of Tony, or ask some questions about the trial or see more data from this trial or elsewhere, please do reach out.
Awesome.
And-
Thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Tony. Bye, everyone.
Cheers.